Get going. So good morning, everybody, from far and close. Welcome to the careerID Confab. Thank you for joining early this morning or evening, whatever your time is. We are doing all our events at this time now because we do have a cohort of students who are based in Asia. Due to COVID, so they couldn't make it in time. So that's why we have these morning hours or evening hours so that everybody can join. Just quick little bit of context. The careerID Confab is our midterm week where there are no classes, and we take this week to focus and reflect, to allow students to focus and reflect on their career journey by immersing themselves into conversation and networking with practice leaders. We had a Compass workshop on Monday, where students focused on their own personal narrative and passion, trying to figure out what is actually they would like to do with design. We had roundtable discussions with practice leaders yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we have a closing panel with alumni on Friday. They will talk about how ID alumni are using their network to shape their career. Today's talk is in the middle of the week and is focused on a future look into the design practice. And we're honored to have Bruce Mau join us to talk about his new book, MC24, Bruce Mau's 24 Principles in Designing Massive Change in Your Life and Work. When I read the announcement about the book a few weeks ago, I thought, what better discussion could we have here at ID with the students and the community? Massive change, that's what we're all about. Principles, we love methods. And life and work, which is becoming clearer and clearer that they both obviously needs to be balanced, but also that design can really play in both. So today's program is Bruce will do a 15-minute presentation on the book. Then we'll have a discussion, which was guided by the 70+ questions we got from you participants. And we kind of structured those into 4 questions that we're going to use for the discussion. And then we'll have open questions for the participants. Remember, this is a webcast Zoom, so you have 2 functions. You have the chat function, which allows you to share your thoughts with the community who is on the phone. And you have the Q&A function. We are going to look for the end of the session to the Q&A. We are not going to take any Q&A before until the last 15 minutes. So you can put it in there, but the chat is more about sharing your thoughts with the group. So with that, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Bruce back to ID. And give me just a quick bio about him. Bruce is a brilliantly creative optimist, very important nowadays, whose love of thorny problems led him to create a methodology for whole system transformation. Across his 30 years of design innovation, he has collaborated with leading organizations, head of states, renowned artists, and fellow optimists. And just a little personal note here, I met Bruce twice in my career. Once when I was a design student, I was still originally based in Toronto and I moved to Chicago for ID. And I spent my summer back and I reached out to Bruce Mau's office because I was really intrigued by the work he was doing. And we met then when I was a student. And then second, when I worked at McDonald's, McDonald's did quite a bit of work, Bruce did quite a bit of work for McDonald's, so as one of those large leading organizations, and we worked there together. So it's a pleasure to sit again next to Bruce. Bruce is a serial entrepreneur since the age of 9. He became an international figure with the publication of his landmark SMLXL, which was designed and co-authored with Graham Coolhouse. He's the author of MC24, founder of Bruce Mau Studio, and founder and CEO of the Massive Change Network, a holistic design collective based here in Chicago. He's also the Chief Design Officer for Freeman, the Pioneers in Life and Brand Experience. So with that, I hand over to Bruce. Welcome and look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Dennis. It's great to be here. It's really exciting. As you mentioned, we're going to look at MC24 today. It's been an extraordinary journey to what we call life-centered design. When my wife and partner, BC Williams, and I moved to Chicago to really take up massive change and really think about, what is the future of design. It was super exciting to be in a city that really had a design culture in a deep way. And IIT and the work that you do is really a big part of that that history and that the reason for being here. So I'm excited to kind of have this conversation. So we want to start where the book starts. Really, it's this was written just before the pandemic hit. It went to press just before the pandemic hit, and it really was as the scope of the pandemic became clear. Frankly, I was a little bit concerned about what we had done in the book because it is radically optimistic, and I called the publisher and said, look, I really think we need to change the book. And they said, well, it's too late. It's at the bindery. It's done. And so I said, look, I'm gonna go through and think about, how do these principles apply to the pandemic? And if that works, then I know that we're okay. So this is the first paragraph of the book. Practically everything we do today needs to change. You think about the way that we live and work. It's still really done in the old way. I mean, almost all of it is done as if we have unlimited resources, as if we can just go on forever. We work as if waste is not a problem. We don't even think waste is an idea, but it's an idea that has really infected our way of work and way of living. We treat nature like a pantry and a toilet, so we think of it as the source of all our food and also where we dump everything. We think short-term, party like there's no tomorrow, and pass the check to future generations. We dump problems we can't solve into places we can't see. And many of our solutions create more problems than they correct. That last concept, I think, is really important to ID and really the practice of design, that we think of problems out of their background, out of their context. And so we isolate them and try to make them an object, and then we lock a solution onto that object. And that methodology has created some of the greatest challenges that we now face. So we're really in a situation where we must make the changes. As a little context, the red line in this graph is population. All the other lines are resource implication. In other words, we weren't kinder, better people back then. In 1750, we were just fewer. And the real problems we now have are success problems, because we've solved so many problems. We've designed so many solutions. The good news is that we won't solve the problems of the future with the tools of the past. This is the work of Ray Kurzweil, and he shows that that our increasing capacity is extraordinarily predictable. Even through wars and recessions and depressions, we are increasing our capacity on a very predictable timeline. And it shows that by about 2025, we'll put the power of a human brain into your pocket for $1,000. So for the price of an iPhone, you'll have the processing capacity of a human brain. And by around 2050, all human brains. I mean, think about how differently we will confront problems and challenges when we have that expanded capacity. The bad news is we have real urgency to change. IPCC suggests that we have about 10 years to really avoid the kind of global worst. And now this on top of that we have this kind of global impact that is putting all of us on Zoom and into boxes. So I started, I was born in northern Canada, about 6 hours north of Toronto. We had the last farm on the left, and outside of a mining town. Our house was built on a kind of rocky hill. What that meant is that we didn't have running water in the winter. And when I was a kid, my job was to go to the well in the valley every day, down by this stream, and provide water every day to the house, which was quite unusual, even back then. That I was one of the few people I knew who didn't have running water in the winter, and I was frankly embarrassed by it and didn't think of it as really part of my life or my identity. Over time, I realized that actually that experience is shared with about 1 billion people still. I know what it means to provide water for a family by hand. And that empathy is actually central to how we define design, how we really think about design practice. I became a designer quite by accident. I didn't really set out to be one, but I loved putting images and words together. And that turned out to be graphic design. And I was very, very fortunate. I met absolutely extraordinary people. I've had, one of the most incredible life experiences as a designer. This is a project I did called Incorporations, and it's about that problem of the singular object. It's about how everything is actually incorporating other systems and flows, and itself incorporated at a higher level in systems and flows. And it really changed the way that I think about design. I have been so fortunate to work with people like Frank Gehry, with MoMA to move them into their new digs. In the process, I became an author. I didn't really start out to be one, but I saw something happening, which was the computer and its application in my field, which was graphic design. I saw it change everything, and I realized I needed to really think about what was changing in our world in order to do the best contribution I could make. So I slowly became a writer. This is one of the first things I wrote, called an Incomplete Manifesto for Growth. And it really was a kind of prototype of the principles, a way of understanding how do we sustain a creative life over the long haul, not for a season, but really for a lifetime. Over time, I became a published author. I authored or co-authored now about a dozen books on the changing nature of the design world, that actually our design context is constantly evolving. And if we really want to understand where should we contribute, we really need to understand the context. I did this project with Rem Koolhaas. It led to many collaborations, including work on the Seattle Public Library, really defining the future of the library in the home of Microsoft. Worked with the NFL on new stadiums, and was commissioned to design Mecca. And I have to say that if you had sort of talked to me as a young man and said, Bruce, you really should pay attention because you're going to have to design Mecca, I would have said that's pretty unlikely. I don't imagine that happening. But it is what happened. I was commissioned to do a 20-year plan. I'm not Muslim, so I can't actually go there. So we did it all with satellite data and video. My response was, it's Mecca, so maybe we should not do a 20-year plan because, we're in for the long haul. And if we do a 1,000-year plan, we can't possibly know what the future will hold. We'll have to design an open system, an open platform for change. And that really became one of the principles of the MC24. What we saw was that design was changing really from what it looks like to what it does, really how we behave. And we saw the world changing from opaque to transparent, from visual form to what we call life-centered design, really our ability to put life at the center and not humans, which is a big subject I'll go into more. In 2004, we did a project called Massive Change, and it really was a kind of life changer for me because we met a few hundred of the world's greatest innovators, people who are fundamentally changing the world. We met the people who took smallpox off the face of the earth and eliminated it forever. And the project, the back cover kind of says it best. It's not about the world of design. It's about the design of the world, our capacity to shape the world. And it led to a very important insight that has really shaped my work ever since. The whole project was based on this quote by Arnold Toynbee, who was a British historian who wrote 20-volume History of the World. And he says, it's not technology and innovation or political conflict and violence that really will dominate when we think about the 20th century in 200 years. We're not going to look back and think those are the big ideas, which is, it's hard to imagine that they're not. But he said, no, it'll be remembered instead as an age in which human society dared to think of the welfare of the whole human race as a practical objective. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that's the biggest idea I've ever heard. I've never heard of anything bigger than that. But when I talked to people, they were absolutely certain that it wasn't true, that we had not done that, that many of my close friends said, Bruce, like, don't touch this thing because it's going to be a disaster. We should have done that. We didn't. And I said, I don't think so. I think we actually are doing this. And so we set up a school called the Institute Without Boundaries to really do the research and really figure out, to do the Massive Change Project and figure out whether or not that was true. What was really striking was that it was so true. It is so true. And it remains true today. And it's staggering that we don't believe it, that we don't start from the premise that that's what we're really up to, that that's what we're committed to, that that's who we are. But it is. So we looked at what we call design economies, the regions of our lives that are being transformed by these new capacities. This is the market economy. The market is not a natural space. It's a design space. And the way that we design it determines what has value and what gets exchanged. We looked at even the design of life itself, that we are designing evolution, that's the scope of the new design possibility. In the end, we realized that what we're really doing is designing wealth, that we're in the process of redesigning wealth. Of course, we still have wealth in capital. That's one way of, that's one metric for wealth. But we have new kinds of wealth, new currencies, wealth of information, wealth of mobility, wealth of access, wealth of choice, etc. There's really new currencies being developed all the time that are our new way of understanding wealth. Probably the most important thing that came out of that process was this diagram that really shows the new scale of design. That the diagram on the left is the old way, that design is a subset of business, that business happens in a cultural context, and that culture happens in the natural world. And what we saw and really first did the kind of cartography for was this idea that ultimately business, culture, and even nature are now design projects. They're our new responsibility. And when I first talked about this and showed this diagram, people were understandably, a little bit upset and accused me of being a megalomaniac. They said, Bruce, you just want to control everything. You're a designer. And I said, it's not about control. For me, my preference is to do nothing. So it's not about control, it's actually about responsibility. That where we fail to design, we design for failure. And you can see all over the world where we failed to design, we destroyed the ecologies that sustain us. And it's absolutely critical that we actually embrace this way of thinking, this responsibility. And this is really what MC24 is all about. At the end of that project, when it opened in Vancouver, before it came to Chicago, I went to a high school to do a kind of presentation like this. And I showed them some of the work that I just showed you. And they said, a young woman came to the microphone after the presentation and said, Mr. Mao, I think you're not thinking big enough. And I said, not too many people accuse me of that these days. It's usually the opposite. What do you mean? And she said, well, in your quote from Toynbee, he said it's about the welfare of the whole human race, but that's a 20th century project. Our project is the welfare of all of life. You should take out the whole human race and put in all of life. And I was frankly really blown away. I thought, what kind of high school is this? And I was, she was absolutely right. We had a blind spot, and she was right. It's such a kind of brilliant incision to put all of life at the center and really think about it in a different way. Since that time, we've been working with a school in Northern Canada called the McEwen School of Architecture in my hometown. And there, it's a tricultural project with French, English, and Indigenous leaders. And they put a different cosmology into an architecture school, which really puts life at the center, not humans. And so I'm on the board of the school. I've been working with them, and I was really blown away by what they're doing. This is a project that students do. They go into the forest with an Indigenous elder, and they produce a birch bark canoe in the way that it's been done for thousands of years. And that canoe, when it's done, when it's broken or just no longer useful, it goes back to the forest floor. Everything in it, becomes food for the next generation of life. It's just a fundamentally different way of understanding our place in the universe. And that's really what we think of as life-centered design, and really life-centered design leadership. So what I wanted to do is really go through a few of the principles that really form the structure of the book. That what we tried to understand was, really, are there principles? Are there principles of this way of working and thinking that we've been doing for 30 years? And what we realized was that it happened so organically for us that it wasn't like we woke up with these principles. It was just an organic process of taking on tough problems, trying to understand as best we could how to deal with them. And then over time, being able to look back and say, what were the principles that really informed that work? And these are the 24. And what we discovered was that there were, in fact, principles that informed the work, and that if we could really capture those and share them, we could help anyone advance their work and really understand a new way of thinking about design as a comprehensivist leadership practice. And I want to just touch on a few of those principles now. The first is first inspire. Design is leadership, lead by design. In our way of working, in our approach, in this MC24 method, we put responsibility for inspiration into our job description. We don't leave it to chance. We don't hope for inspiration. It's not a side effect. It's actually our first responsibility, because the only way to make real change is to inspire. You can't. I don't have the control. I don't have the. I can't make people do things. I can't make them do the right thing. The only real tool I have is inspiration. That I can show them what the new thing looks like, and I can show them how to get there, and I can show them the impact that it might have. My responsibility in that process is to inspire them, to really show them a future that is better than their past. And this applies to, I think one of the things that we have to start with is the idea that this is not exclusive to professional designers. We are all designing our future. We're all futurists. We're all thinking about how we want to live tomorrow, and how we want to live in the future, and how we want to grow up, and what we want our career to look like. We're designing. And so if you take that responsibility and you say, look, my responsibility is to inspire myself to begin with. It really changes the way we think about the practice, and it has a kind of impact on how we work and how we think in a really profound way. It's really the only principle that is in sequence. In other words, this is a toolbox, not a linear method. It's not that you start with one and work your way through to 24. It's like having a toolbox at home. You don't always start with a hammer. But this one is so foundational that it really does come first. Another one I'd like to touch on is begin with fact-based optimism, which seems to be in short supply at the moment. But as designers, we do not have the luxury of cynicism. We can't simply say things are bad all over. Our job, our responsibility, is to bring an optimistic outlook to a problem. But it's not an optimism of Pollyanna. It's not like I'm an idiot and everything's going to be fine. It's really based in fact to say, look, let's look at the data, let's look at the facts, understand what's really going on, but approach it with the possibility of solving it, that we have the real opportunity to solve these things. And when you really look at the data, what you see is really striking, that over the last 200 years, we've seen an extraordinary inversion, a positive inversion in the data. This is the work of Max Roser at Our World in Data. And he's done, some of the most important metrics to try to look at, what's happening in our world over the last 200 years. And what you can see, if you look at, poverty, for instance, what's really striking to me is how smooth the line is. It's not randomly kind of wandering around very much. It's, there are a few little pauses along the way, and you can kind of imagine what those are. But it's very deliberate, very consistent, moving in the right direction. And when you consider how radical that changes, it's really extraordinary that this is the time we're living in. 200 years ago, only 6 out of 100 were not living in extreme poverty. So 200 years ago, out of the whole world, only 6 are not in abject poverty. Today, it's less than 10 out of 100. And you can see that that line is going, inexorably in the right direction. And we have obviously huge amounts of work to do to continue to bring that number down. And the pandemic will no doubt set that back. There will be a flattening of that line again over time. But we are committed to that idea. And I think for me, this kind of principle is so important in terms of articulating, really understanding who are we and what are we committed to. In education, only 17 had basic education 200 years ago. Only 17 out of 100. Today, only 14 have not, do not have it. And the similar is true in infant mortality, vaccination, democracy. Obviously in democracy, it's much bumpier a road, but you can see where it's going. And we, our job in a way is to continue those directions. I wanted to touch on 2 more. One is we're not separate from or above nature. And this for me is the kind of Copernican change in the MC24. It really changes everything. We had the extraordinary experience of going into the jungle with E.O. Wilson in Panama. And he explained to us that there is only one thing on the planet, it's life. And life has an experiment going on in form. And we are one of those forms, that's all. We're not a special case, we're not separate from, we didn't inherit nature, we don't own it, and we're not a special kind of outstanding example. And when you start to understand that, you realize we are the living world. And what we do is natural. So it's either natural toxic or natural non-toxic. It's natural, imposing and limiting and against nature, or it's natural with nature. And so when we start to understand this, we really change almost everything that we do. It's one of the most kind of profoundly disorienting of the principles, and it really kind of comes from this kind of experience that we did this project with Frank Gehry in Panama. It's the world's first museum of biodiversity. It starts with what we call the Panorama, which is a kind of box of cinema. It's like a cube. We can put you in the cube and take you through the forest into the canopy and down into the ocean and back into Panama City where the museum is. And everything about that project was about the ecosystem and the diversity and our long-term understanding of life. How what is life and how is it ordered? And then I want to end with this: the idea of compete with beauty. That beauty is a competitive idea. We will move heaven and earth for beauty. We'll suffer for beauty. We'll pay more for beauty. Beauty is central to our definition of who we are, and yet we almost don't acknowledge it. We don't teach it. if you walked into an architecture school today and put up a project and said, this is my project and I did it because it's beautiful, you would get an F. We need to rethink our understanding and commitment and the real power of beauty. So I'll end with that.
Wonderful, Bruce. Thank you. And really, I wrote down some really relevant things for thinking in the design education environment. Your clear focus on saying it's number one about inspiration, and number two about fact-based optimism. We did a research on what we call Lead with Purpose with 50 organizations to understand how to maximize the value of design. And a lot came up with the fact that design can become the steward of purpose for an organization. The same that finance is kind of focused on the financial health. Designers have the unique power by being able to bring to life the intent, the purpose for an organization, and then hold the organization accountable. I see a lot of similarities with the inspiration and the fact-based optimism. I also was particularly struck about your nature comment and your beauty comment. Nature, I think, is something we have started to embrace with a new professor, Wesley Ashton, who joined us as a professor with focusing on circular economy and environmental. I think the beauty part is something that we always used to call resolved. Is it a well-resolved design? But I think having the courage to actually call it beauty makes it even bigger. And I think that's something that we might want to take on. So you have answered a lot of the questions already, but let's, so we'll quickly have 4 things to discuss. One is that the participants really wanted to know on going deeper on driving the change. They were particularly interested, in your opinion, what change would you most generously want to inspire? Examples that they brought up, and it came up again in the chat as well. What if anti-racism or racism would follow the curve that you've shown, all the curves you've shown on poverty going down? Should one of the changes that we should prioritize be anti-racist? Second one is the way government works. A third one is the shift from shareholder to stakeholder economy. And the fourth one was kind of new technologies. Are they going to be like self-driving cars and building systems, or living in the ocean? Or improving social media? So is it more kind of the technology, man-made things that we need to change, how we deal with technology? And the last one was, interestingly, design education. Do we need to dramatically change design education to bring the biggest change? So when you think about yourself generally, which changes do you think are the most urgent one, or would inspire you, or you would tell people going into design, students going into the practice, what the world needs them to work on?
Yeah. Well, I think what you touched on is really important, that what we saw is that there's a common denominator in design of caring. Like if you think about what the designer does differently than other people in a process, is they really care about the individual citizen experience. So what's the experience of that citizen? And how can I understand it? How can I really develop a kind of practice of empathy and care about that person? And when I care about that person, by extension, I have to care about their community, because you can't have a thriving individual in a toxic community. And again, by extension, you have to care about their environment, their context. Excuse me. And you have to think about, how is their environment supporting them? How are we sustaining them? Excuse me. And that idea of caring and empathy really is at the center of a whole raft of problems that we're facing. Racism, anti-gay bigotry, violence, ecological destruction. It really comes back to that challenge of empathy. And this is where I think design learning can be really important, not only for designers, but for citizens generally. And I really believe we should begin design education at the very outset, that we need to empower our children to understand that they are responsible for the world. And that they have a kind of understanding that they have not only the responsibility but also the power to shape the world around them. that they live in a designed world. So I think that if you really think about that common denominator of the challenge of empathy and put that into everything that we do, we see a way of actually confronting so many of the challenges that you touched on.
I love your definition of design as being responsible and having the power to share the world with. That's a very broad definition. I think one of the questions we're coming later to is how is the design practice changing, and that would be good. A second question is more on the how to drive change, and obviously you have the 24 principles that you shared. I think the one about inspiration, the one about fact-based optimism, and the one around forest, think like you're in the forest, are three things that I think you are highlighting that designers need to do as a role, they need to take on to be able to drive change. Well, questions people had was, how do designers have to change themselves from an approach to be able to do the work like that? The second was, what's the right scope? Are you scoping on the organization, or are you trying to change the culture? I think your inspiration thing might answer that, or even movement building. Are you trying to move, do you need to go to the point of building a movement within the organizations you work in to be able to change the culture and drive change? And then ambition, should you go more for evolutionary change or revolutionary change when you approach these? Particularly, very often these questions came from the point of view, I'm a manager level designer, a mid-level designer in an organization, and you ask, and I would like to do massive change, but how can I do that? So those are the question on kind of how, any tips on the role of design beyond your principles and how to be able to drive that?
I think one of the things that that I think is a general concern, general condition, is that we don't really understand how powerful we are. I don't think designers realize that they have their hands on the steering wheel. They have the ability to create the vision. And Simon Sinek talks about how important it is for a vision to be visual, that people can actually see the future. Designers are producing that vision. So we're in that conversation, and I think too often we are merely in service. In other words, we're just kind of doing as we're told. And I think one of the things that we've done, partly by temperament and partly by luck, is really to be involved in the story, to be involved in the narrative, to design the story, to say, look, here's what we can do. And a lot of the tools that we developed and we show in the book actually are really about that method and about what it takes to help an organization to see it, and also what it takes to accept the responsibility that you have, to really embrace that capacity to create a vision and to build the movement that you need to make that happen. And we have, one of the tools that we have is called the scenarios method. And it basically is a way for organizations to explore really bold ideas in a safe way, and not to kind of, not to seem like we're betting the house on the most, radical way of thinking. Really a kind of way to kind of get, to find a pathway to those bold ideas, but not to ignore them or to let them die.
I love that call. I think the whole idea of massive change is the call to be bold. And I think the idea of designers having their hands on the steering wheel and vision to be visual, I think is a very good phrase to think about as we focus on it. We have two more and then we open it up for questions. So one of the questions set of the questions were around changing in the design practice. What do you think the future design practice will look like? You already talked a little about that, but the focus was also very much on collaboration with other disciplines and potential integrations with like policy, data science, or business, or that's on one end, so getting more kind of the professional and interprofessional way. The other one was, what about design more on process, design as a social practice, more what you're doing in Northern Canada with the architecture school there. And then, so those were kind of the, and then lastly, kind of how does the pandemic influence it? So those were kind of the 3 things. So are we shifting more into becoming more technical with other integration with other disciplines, or are we becoming more design as a social practice? And how is the pandemic influencing it?
I think one of the, excuse me, one of the most important dimensions of a design methodology is synthesis. So if you think about what designers do, we take hundreds, even thousands of inputs, and we produce one coherent output. And that coherence really is the beauty that we talk about. So that kind of clarity and coherence really comes from beauty. I mean, it's why Steve Jobs insisted that the motherboard be beautiful, right? So why should the motherboard be beautiful? And you realize that what he was really insisting on was coherence. He wanted clarity, and beauty was a kind of a proxy for clarity. And he applied that beauty strategy to the whole business. And I would ask our clients, you know, what's your beauty strategy? Almost no one has one. Mm-hmm. Steve Jobs had one, and he produced, you know, a company worth $2 trillion. You know, the most valuable company in history. If you take beauty out of that business, it's a reasonably good technology company that you've probably never heard of. And so it really is kind of putting that kind of coherence at the core that that I think really informs you know, how we think about how we work and what we do.
And 2 follow-up questions on that. How important is the ego of the designer, and how is it the idea of being objectively versus subjectively designing? So that's something a lot of our design students are currently struggling with, because one hand fact-based, on the other hand obviously passion-driven.
One of the principles is new wicked problems demand new wicked teams, and the real insight there is that you know, our first generation solutions produce new higher order complexity problems. In other words, when we solved transportation, you know, when we solved movement and we invented the car, we invented at the same time climate change. You know, we produced a new order, higher order complexity problem. Those problems don't fit into our disciplines. Climate change is not a design problem in the classical sense. It's not an engineering problem. It's really a new kind of design culture problem. And to confront that, we need complex teams. We need teams that are higher order complexity teams than the ones that created the problems in the first place. To do that, it means that you need to understand what it means to be a team player. And in MC24, we outline the 7 behaviors of a wicked team player. You know, what it means to be on, you know, what Bill Buxton calls you know, a Renaissance team. That you need the ego of the designer to be an expert, to drive your knowledge, to, you know, to be excellent in what you do. At the same time, you need an openness for collaboration that is equal to, or, you know, in some ways counteracts that that need for the individual, where you really can be a follower at certain moments in the process. You can take a step back because someone else is really demonstrating leadership, and having the kind of humility and the skill really to do that, I think is an important part of the kind of new design practice.
Wonderful. That's good. So a last question, and I'm starting to integrate already the questions that come in. But the last topic of discussion is obviously design. Your design school is design career advice. And what students want to know, what is your main advice for design students entering the design industry within the next few years? The questions under there that came up is, what is better? Is it better being a niche designer or one who is a mixed designer? One that I think is particularly targeted at your career, is graphic design still relevant as a discipline, or does you have to go broader, given that that's your origin? How many focus are healthy, so to avoid overwhelming, or can you be too much of a mixed designer, so you're not good in anything anymore? And lastly, what many of our students struggle with at ID is how to make the design we do, which is more the design of systems and bigger problems, how to make that more understandable, approachable to organizations that are looking to hire designers, because there's still many of them come looking for product designers or graphic designers. So that's a kind of career advice that our students are looking for.
Yeah.
Any thoughts you would have would be very helpful.
I think the fundamental there is the last principle in the book, which is work on what you love. And I have to say that during the process, I was skeptical at times of whether it should be a principle, that whether we should include this, seemingly very soft idea. But over time, I realized it's maybe the most important of the principles. Work on what you love. Give your energy to the things you love and starve everything else. Don't give energy and attention to the things that you're against. And really make your life dedicated to the things that you love and the work that you're interested in and the approach that you want to take. When I was very young, I had a client, first starting out, I had a client and they wanted me to do their posters, their communication for an organization called New Music Toronto. And they had a very low budget. And so I said, look, I'll do them. On one condition: you can't change them. You can reject them. You can say no. And if you say no, I'll do another one. But you can't tell me how to fix it. You can only say no. It's yes or no. And if you say no over and over, I'll keep doing them. I'll do one and I'll do them until you're happy. But I won't. But you're not allowed to fix them. And
what
so
happened? How many did you have to do?
I did a lot. They loved them all. They never said no.
Okay.
And I was able to do work that I was really happy with. It was exactly how I wanted to do it. And what that really was about for me was putting out a pure signal. I had this kind of weird idea in my mind as a young man that there was a kind of thin filament around the whole world. It was like there was a layer around the whole planet. And in that thin layer, there were particles. And the particles were the people that I was looking for. And I needed them to do my work in my life. And they were looking for me. We were perfect for each other, but we didn't know that yet. They'd never heard of me. And I didn't know who they were. And I realized that the only way they would find me is if I put out a pure signal. If I put the truth into that thin layer, they could eventually find me, and I would have to do it for a long time. So I lived very, very modestly. I lived like a student for decades in order to do that, in order to put out, a pure signal and to find those people. And I found one in Toronto, and I found one in Los Angeles, and I found one in Paris and one in Rotterdam. And it has been the most extraordinary adventure possible. And I think it really goes back to that idea, that principle of work on what you love. And ultimately that, it's paradoxical because it suggests to be generous, be selfish, right? Start with selfishness so that you do what you believe and you are inspired by and you contribute the most to. And that's the most that you have to give. If you think about what you have to give in the world, that's what you have to give. You have to give your idea, your insight, your love. And that's ultimately the the most that we could hope from you?
I love that answer, and I think it's very much something that can get lost in trying to meet different market demands, which are impossible for one person to all meet at the same time. And I think the world relies on each person finding it.
I had a client once who stopped me in the middle of a presentation and said, "Do you love this?" And I was like,
"That's great."
It really was like, what? And what a freaking great question. It's the question. He was absolutely right. I mean, you think about, I realize that mostly when I'm working with an organization, with a person, what they're really concerned of is, you know, do you believe this? Is this it? Right? Like, are you committed to this? And I think that kind of love is so important in work and ultimately in success, because I think a lot of the questions were about success. Right?
That's a great question to add to our critique. So we have two more questions coming in that I think are interesting. One is, was asked before already, how has the pandemic, do you think, impacted your MC24, if at all?
I think what has happened is that it has radically accelerated the progress. In other words, I think we were facing crisis, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, but we were not so clear what that would mean or could mean. And suddenly everyone realizes, wow, this is real, it's global, and we can change things. I think one of the gifts of the pandemic is that people realize, oh, we can actually change everything. Things that we thought were permanent, that you couldn't possibly change, are changed. I mean, often not for the better, but they are certainly changed. And so it really opens up a kind of world of possibility to say, since we designed it, you live a designed life. We designed it, so we can redesign it. And it really opens up the possibility in a way that I don't think, certainly in my lifetime has not happened before. We have a unique opportunity in the coming year to really make an impact. And, you mentioned earlier the kind of importance of education. And for me, it's one of the things that we're really looking seriously at to try to understand. And it really kind of goes to the basic insight and the impulse to create MC24, to say, how do we put these principles and the power of design into the hands of as many people as possible, not only designers. Mm-hmm. We need partners in the rest of the world to have the language of design so that we can do the best we can. We need them to understand beauty, even if they can't produce it. We can. If they understand beauty, the dimensions of beauty and the language of beauty, they don't need to get a degree in design. If they start to think about beauty as part of their strategy, it will fundamentally change the possibilities for designers.
So one of our founder, Holy Knowledge, actually declared in his book, Vision in Motion, that it was even more important to educate non-designers than designers. So when he opened the school in Chicago as the new Bauhaus, he started right away with evening classes for non-designers back in the 30s. So completely aligned with that. And we always have done executive education, like trying to now actually shift more in community-based labs and with Chris's work. So last question, and probably the kind of a great ending, is how, as the design practice, design education, how does one shift from kind of user-centered design to the bigger area, your circles, to kind of this life-centered design? I think in our talks we had before, we talked that we have changed, starting to use the term integral design, saying that it has to include all the issues, all matters of concern from a lateral point of view, but it also has to be a solution that is unifying. So I think you called it life-centered design, but what do you think from a design education point of view? What would you advise design schools, my colleagues, that we need to change to help create people who can lead the inspiration and lead the beauty aspect, as you just shared.
One of the principles is design the invisible. And I think it's, if you think about what happened in art in the last century, Duchamp was instrumental, Marcel Duchamp was instrumental in liberating art from what he called the tyranny of the eye. So he talked about how he wanted to make life art, and he wanted to make anything that we do art, and really allow for art to be much broader in its kind of conception and much broader in its presence in our life and the way that we think and work and live. And that really hasn't happened in design. We still are governed by the eyeball. We talk about eyeballs and getting eyeballs. And we really, all of our tools are for one sense. They're really for the sense of vision. And we define our products in terms that we can see. And we think of it as an object. And I think that when you say design the invisible, you really expand that concept to say, look, we're going to design the system infrastructure. We're going to design the flow of matter and energy. In the book, I talk about how if you look at an object like a water bottle, we think of the design as the visual form of that bottle. But the real design is the continuous flow of matter and energy. And it's like a movie. It's like an endless movie that's cycling endlessly through. We're looking at a still from the movie and trying to figure out the plot. We need to design the plot. We need to design the flow. We need to design that movie. And we need to design it for perpetuity so the movie can go on forever. Because right now, the way that we're designing almost everything is really short term. It's really for us. And we're passing that problem to our kids and saying, sorry, guys, you got to clean up this mess that we made.
I couldn't think of a better way to end this talk, Bruce. I love the design the plot, design the movie, design for perpetuity. I think that is the world we live in and the challenge for designers and all designers, not even the design degree, to do that. So thank you so much for giving us your time. Given that we're both in Chicago, I hope that we can find ways to collaborate even more. I think our students would love to hear more and collaborate perhaps on projects that they could work on together with you and your institute. So thank you all the participants for joining, for the great question you asked, and it's recorded. So we'll put in our YouTube link so you can watch it again. And have a good rest of the morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.